Hey there, this is Bernie Borges, CEO of Find and Convert, and your host of the Social Business Engine podcast. This is the podcast that showcases people who are using social media in their business strategy and getting results that they want to share with you. This is episode 72, and it's a little bit different. I recorded this podcast on location at the Podcast Movement Conference in Fort Worth, Texas on August 2nd, 2015. Now, before I introduce my guests, yes, plural, more than one, I want to tell you a little bit about this conference, Podcast Movement. Podcast Movement is an annual conference, and this was only the second year, and it's already wildly popular. More than 1,100 people attended Podcast Movement 2015. The conference featured over 80 speakers, plus keynote presentations from Sarah Koenig, who's the host of the breakout hit Serial podcast, Mark Maron, a popular stand-up comedian and host of the WTF podcast. Now, a defining moment for him, and for all podcasters really everywhere, is when President Obama appeared as a guest on his podcast that was recorded in his studio, which is in his garage in suburban Los Angeles. How cool is that? Other notable keynotes included Pat Flynn, Aisha Taylor, John Lee Dumas, Lou Mongello, and Roman Mars, all of which gave inspiring and often entertaining keynote presentations. Now, the Podcast Movement Conference is named as such because the four founders, who are podcasters themselves, recognized that podcasters are passionate about the medium, and the time is right to create a community of podcasters to learn, grow, and commune with each other to help podcasting become even more mainstream than it already is. Now, here's a data point for you. According to a research report from Edison Research, 33% of Americans over the age of 12 have listened to a podcast. Now, this is up from 23% in 2010. Also, most new model cars in 2016 will drive off the lot with podcast channels already built in. Folks, the podcast movement is underway, and I am super excited about it. In fact, my calendar's already marked for Podcast Movement 2016, which will be in Chicago, July 6th through the 8th. And if you have any interest in podcasting, go to podcastmovement.com and learn more about this amazing conference. Maybe I'll meet you there in Chicago next July. Now, I want to explain how I recorded this podcast. Buzzsprout was one of the sponsors on the exhibit floor at Podcast Movement, and they built a transportable recording booth, and I'll have a picture of it in the show notes. So while you're going to hear the buzz of the crowd in the background, the recording booth was well insulated to provide for a really great podcast recording experience. Now, on this episode, I have two guests. Scott Beebe is currently a business coach and strategist. His company, mybusinessonpurpose.com, cool name, huh? And Scott previously worked for a Fortune 100 company, and that's what we talk about. He's going to share his experience about why this company, his previous employer, and many other large companies are not currently embracing the podcast medium or the podcast movement. Now, my other guest is Matt Miller. Matt is president of a cool company called School Spirit Vending, and he's going to explain what they do in the interview. Matt reveals not one, but two ways that he's embracing podcasting in his business. Now, I know that this has been an unusually long introduction, and before I get to the interview, I want you to know that this episode is sponsored by my friends at Cision, a leading global media intelligence company. Soon, we're going to publish another social business journal, and this one is going to feature 5 enterprise-level brands, and they're going to answer the question, what's working in social media marketing? Now, if you are already subscribed to receive our weekly podcast in your email inbox, then you'll get notified when we publish this journal. But you need to be subscribed by email to get that notification. Now, if you're not subscribed to get our weekly updates, which we email every Friday morning with each podcast episode that we release, you can get subscribed by texting, are you ready for this? Texting 38470 and then enter SBE show as the text message. So once again, you can text 38470 and then enter SBE show as the text message, and it's not case sensitive. And then you will get subscribed so that we can notify you when this new journal issue gets released. And now, finally, here's my interview with Scott Beebe and Matt Miller, which I recorded on location at Podcast Movement 2015. Hey, Scott, let's go with you first, buddy.
All right, Bernie.
So, big corporations, why aren't they podcasting? Now, you have some experience in a Fortune 100 company. What was your experience? What was their trepidation, their reasons for not wanting to podcast?
You can really boil it down to one word, and it's fear. Now, there's a lot of nuances around that idea of fear. During the time I was with the company, an attorney was actually running the company. Nothing against attorneys, but the reality is an attorney mindset as the head of the corporation. When it comes to when you've got tens of thousands of employees, and they've all got access to social media, and they've all got minds and worldviews and everything else that they're dealing with, obviously from an attorney mindset, when you're looking at a corporation and all of these people, you take a risk. And at the end of the day, I believe the company saw that the risk was not worth the reward if they were going to democratize communications throughout the company. And so I think it all boiled down to fear and basically risk mitigation.
But is podcasting democratizing communication throughout the entire company? I mean, if a big corporation, a Fortune 100 company, is going to start a podcast or a series of podcasts, how is that democratizing it across the entire organization?
Well, it's a good question, and it really depends on the level of democracy, if you will, that you give to the podcast. For instance, is the podcast kind of owned and run by the company? So let's contrast that to just traditional social media. Both are vocal outlets. One is audio and the others are mainly text. But at the end of the day, you're giving somebody a platform to be able to share the message that they have. In social media, when you open that up to the rest of the company, everybody has a voice in that. In podcasting, it could be a little bit different, whereas the host of the actual podcast is the one that gets the voice, and so the company can control the voice in some vein, but then the question becomes, what's the level of editing, both realistically and kind of theoretically, in the podcast interview to see what voice is going to get out to the company. And some employees of the company will see that as kind of corporate speak all over again, and which then defeats the purpose of the podcast in the first place.
Sure. So what are some examples or some possible ways that a large Fortune 100 or Fortune 5,000, it doesn't have to be a mega corporation, could get into podcasting and use podcasting as a method of communication?
Well, in the company that I worked for, and a lot of large companies have field-based employees. And being a field-based employee, from my perspective, one of the things that was really we missed out on is we didn't get to hear the inside. We heard the inside of the business that was polished, but we didn't get to hear the inside of the business that was just back and forth. Conversational, exactly right. And so there's a real value that a company or a corporation can bring to their field-based colleagues to have a conversational discussion about life, work, outside of the framework of the big major networks. But then flip that on its side and go to the field-based colleagues. There were a lot of times in the field we didn't feel like the upper management really got a good understanding of what we were seeing from the ground. And part of that was concerning because you were fearful of your job. But if they start to open podcasting up as a true dialogue back and forth without repercussion and genuine honesty, it could be a real value for the corporation long term.
Sure. And of course, in post-production, it can be edited and vetted and all that. Great. So that's terrific. Thank you, Scott. So I want to now segue to a conversation with Matt Miller. And Matt is, as I said in my intro, president of SSV. I'll let him elaborate on that. But because, Matt, you guys you're using podcasting. So first, talk a little bit about the company and how you're using podcasting currently.
Yeah, Bernie, my company's called School Spirit Vending. We specialize in hassle-free fundraising for schools. And along with that, we're a franchise that helps busy professionals diversify and create secondary income streams while they're supporting those schools in fundraising. And I actually came from a corporate job as well, was out in the field just like Scott talked about. Very, very impersonal, and you're always out on an island. And with my company, I work today with about 60 different franchisees across the country in about 23 states. Very difficult to maintain a level of community and communication with a scenario like that. We're not meeting every week for corporate meetings, right?
Yeah.
So been blogging for a while, been doing some things like that. But what I found is, as busy as my guys are today, I wasn't reaching a lot of them because they actually had to stop what they were doing to read that blog post.
Right.
So I went to Social Media Marketing World several months ago this last spring, and had listened to a few podcasts before, but really didn't know anything about it. And that really opened my eyes. And so I just recently finished Cliff Ravenscraft's course on podcasting A to Z, and have begun over the last couple of months podcasting to my guys, being able to share best practices, being able to share policy, being able to share communications.
What kind of feedback are you getting from your team?
The guys are loving it, because they can subscribe to it just like any other podcast. Right. When they're out mowing the lawn, when they're working out, when they're driving down the road, they can now take 15 to 30 minutes to on a weekly basis stay up to speed with what we're doing.
Right.
It's given me a much bigger voice. It's given our team a much bigger voice, and it's really brought our community together in a big way because people are able to get to know one another through that relationship that's being developed through the audio.
Right. Well, you mentioned the two big C's, community and communication. So now let's talk about another podcast initiative that you're planning. You told me about before we started recording that you're planning an external podcast. What's that going to be about?
Yeah, it's called the School Zone Podcast, schoolzonepodcast.com. And I work in the school fundraising space, right? And most fundraising companies, there's trade shows throughout the year where they kind of share their message. Otherwise, there's a website. Well, there's a lot more to what they do and how they do it, and best practices and success stories and all that there as well. And so my podcast is going to give them a voice, but it's also going to give a voice to the PTA moms and the administrators in many of our schools, so that they have an opportunity to really talk about the pain points that they have, and hopefully it will allow both communities to better work together more cohesively, better understand one another, and support one another in the process.
So what I'm hearing, Matt, is that you are once again leveraging those two big C's. It's communication. You're giving them a voice. You're giving them a venue, a medium to communicate, and also to build and strengthen their communities.
Correct. And it's amazing. Most of these guys don't even know what a podcast is. I mean, when I do an interview with somebody in this forum, they know how to get on Skype. They know how to do all those things. So there's going to be a lot of education that's involved. But it's exciting to know that I'm going to be able to help usher that in a community that is still probably about 20 years behind the group of folks here at Podcast Movement.
So do you anticipate any kind of obstacles? That whole issue that you just mentioned, Matt, about how they don't even know what a podcast is. So do you think you're going to have to go through an education process to kind of get them ramped up on how to consume the podcast content?
I will, but I already work with 2,000 schools. So thankfully, I have an offline presence that is going to help with that education process. And, with Facebook groups and a lot of the other resources that schools are using, I think we're going to have some learning and ramp up time as well. But it's going to be exciting because I think we always talk about niching down, right? Well, there's not a whole lot more niche than elementary school fundraising, but it's an exciting time, and it's amazing how many companies I've talked to in the last month or two that have been like, I'd love to, and then they're like, how much is it going to cost? Nothing. I just want to talk. Let me interview you.
So then what is your business goal behind that external podcast?
My business goal is ultimately to make more people aware of what we do, which is hassle-free fundraising with my two companies. And
but you're not promoting your company in these podcasts.
No, they'll be sponsors of it. My goal will ultimately be to have some schools where where we are a part of their fundraising mix, have them on, interview them, and hopefully they say good things about us as well.
Sure.
But ultimately, no, it's just to provide more value for the community.
There you go.
I don't compete with any of the other companies with what I do, so we can all coexist.
Right.
And in the process, a rising tide raises all ships.
Right. So you're doing awareness building, brand building, and then delivering value by, again, giving them a venue to communicate and build community.
Correct.
And then in the process, building your company's brand so that when you're looking for the opportunity to kind of pitch your offering, you've got that brand awareness and there's value, there's relationship, there's credibility already there.
Correct.
So what we heard from Scott was that the big companies have fear that are driven by kind of the legal ramifications or the risk associated with podcasting. And Matt, in your case, what we're hearing is, now of course you're not a big company that's driven by the legal mindset or the legal motivation, but you're still a legitimate business. You've been in business, 8 or 9 years, you mentioned?
8 years, yeah.
Yeah, so a very legitimate business, a franchisor. So you're communicating internally with your team. They really enjoy that communication. It's a productive way for them to hear what's going on, learn, et cetera. It's probably good for morale as well because you're not pounding them through a lot of emails or a lot of long narrative documents, right?
Correct.
So like you said, they can mow the lawn and go to the gym and consume that content. But then you're also planning that external podcast to build that community and then help the schools actually do something productive for themselves.
Yes. Yeah.
So any final takeaways that you want to give to any listeners out there that are, we might be reaching some people in the Fortune 100 market, right, that heard that fear word, and we might be reaching, people in the small business category that maybe aren't podcasting today. So any advice to anybody out there in a corporate setting that isn't podcasting today?
I would be afraid of not figuring out how to embrace and harness the new technology, because especially with the millennials, which are very soon going to supplant all of us Generation Xers, right?
Yeah, quick comment on that. I have a 24-year-old and a 19-year-old, and my 24-year-old has known about podcasting. My 19-year-old is now listening to podcasts. Now, he's not listening to my podcast because this topic doesn't interest him, but he's listening to podcasts, and I'm going to tell you that was not the case a year ago. So.
Yeah, and as I understand it, a lot of the new 2016 car models are going to now start having their radios outfitted with digital radio. We've already taken control of our TV set in our homes, and in the next few years, all of us are going to completely take care of our radio stream as well. Mm-hmm. And companies need to understand that and embrace it, figure it out, but also not try to fit it into the old worn-out corporate culture that they had in the past, but embrace some of the new thought and some of the new trends. I mean, the people here at this event and the angles that they come at this is so refreshing, and it is so anti everything that you and I were brought up to understand.
Right. Yeah.
And it can be scary, but it's an exciting time, and I hope they choose to embrace it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to thank both of my guests, Scott Beebe and Matt Miller, for joining me here on this special episode of Social Business Engine here at Podcast Movement 2015 in Fort Worth, Texas. My listeners know that I'll have links in the show notes to the things that we discussed here today. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Bernie.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my interviews with Scott Beebe and Matt Miller, recorded on location at Podcast Movement 2015. The fear factor is the biggest reason that Scott believes the companies are not embracing the podcast movement. And, I agree. I think that's a factor for sure. But I also think that many companies just aren't aware of the power of the podcast medium. Now, that's why my team and I at Find and Convert are working on training material on podcasting for brand marketers. We recently helped a Fortune 1000 client develop their podcast strategy, and we're just now getting ready to launch it. In fact, I hope to have this client on the show in a couple of months so that he can share their story with you. Now, we're going to take that experience and we're going to create training content. Now, at the time of this recording, we're still working on that, and we're probably just going to start with a free webinar sometime in the fourth quarter of 2015 overviewing the podcast strategy and implementation process. Now, if you work for a corporate brand and you want to be notified when this webinar gets scheduled, be sure to subscribe to our weekly podcast updates by email. As I mentioned in the intro, if you're not subscribed, you can text me at 38470 and enter SBE Show to get subscribed. Again, text 38470 and enter SBE Show to get subscribed, and it's not case sensitive. Now, if you're on a desktop right now, you can just as easily hit our subscribe page on our website at socialbusinessengine.com. Hey, if you're a regular listener to the Social Business Engine podcast, have you written a review in iTunes or Stitcher yet? If not, would you take a minute to write a review to increase the chance that other people might discover this podcast? And then let me know that you wrote the review so that I can express my sincere thanks to you. Hey, one more thing. I really do enjoy hearing from my listeners. I really, really do. And some people reach out to me through Twitter at Bernie Borges, also through our Twitter handle for Social Business Engine, which is at SB Engine. Some people also reply to me in my weekly email updates that are sent every Friday morning because they come from me. And then some people connect with me on LinkedIn. Now, if you send me a LinkedIn invitation, please personalize it and tell me that you've listened to my podcast. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this particular podcast episode. Again, I want to encourage you to check out the Podcast Movement Conference next July if you want to become part of this podcasting community. You won't regret attending that event. As always, remember to visit our show notes page at socialbusinessengine.com/podcasts to get links to the stuff that we discuss here today, including pictures of me recording this podcast on location in a portable recording booth at Podcast Movement. Well, that is a wrap for this episode, and this is Bernie Borges of Find and Convert, wishing you continued success on your social business journey.